The dust from Reverend Thaddeus Crane's boots still hung in the air of the parlor when Penelope Lawson realized her marriage was over, though the papers would not be signed for another 3 weeks. She sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, listening to her husband James explain to their families that God had spoken through the preacher's revelation. After 5 years of marriage without a child, Reverend Crane had declared during Sunday service that some women were cursed with barren wombs as punishment for sins, and James had taken those words as divine permission to seek an annulment. It was April of 1884 in Kingfisher, Oklahoma Territory, and Penelope had just turned 24 years old, which meant she was staring down a future as a divorced woman in a town of barely 300 souls who would all know her shame. Her mother wept quietly in the corner while James's father nodded approvingly, and Penelope felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg, spilling out not tears but a cold, hard determination. She would not beg. She would not plead for a man who believed a pompous preacher over the woman he had promised to love in sickness and in health. When the room finally emptied and she stood alone in the house that would no longer be hers, she walked to the bedroom, pulled out her traveling trunk, and began to pack her belongings with steady hands. She had saved a small amount of money from selling her embroidery work, enough to rent a room at the boarding house for a month or two while she figured out what came next. The sun was setting over the prairie when she closed the trunk, casting long shadows across the floorboards, and she did not look back as she walked out the front door. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, who asked no questions when Penelope arrived with her trunk and a request for the smallest, cheapest room available. The news of the annulment spread through Kingfisher like wildfire through dry grass, and within days Penelope could feel the weight of judgment everywhere she went. Women whispered behind their hands at the general store. Men tipped their hats but did not meet her eyes. Even the children seemed to sense something wrong, giving her a wide berth when she walked down the dusty main street. Reverend Crane delivered a sermon the following Sunday about the importance of accepting God's will, though Penelope did not attend to hear it. She had decided that if God truly had cursed her, then she wanted nothing more to do with him or his earthly representatives. She found work taking in laundry and mending clothes, which paid barely enough to cover her room and meals. Her hands grew red and raw from the lye soap, and her back ached from bending over the washboard, but she preferred the honest pain of labor to the suffocating pity she encountered everywhere else. Mrs. Fletcher was kind in her gruff way, often leaving extra biscuits outside Penelope's door, and slowly Penelope began to build a new routine in the wreckage of her old life. She woke before dawn, worked until her fingers cramped, ate simple meals alone in her room, and fell into bed too exhausted to dream. Weeks passed this way, and she began to think that perhaps this was simply what her life would be now, a quiet existence on the margins of a town that had decided she was marked by divine displeasure. Then Preston Garrett rode into Kingfisher on a hot morning in late May, trailing 3 horses and looking for work at the cattle ranch 5 miles outside of town. He was 26 years old, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting, and he had the easy, confident manner of a man who had spent most of his life sleeping under stars and trusting his instincts. He stopped at the general store to buy supplies, and that was where he first saw Penelope, standing at the counter with a basket of mended shirts she was returning to Mr. Anderson, the store owner. She wore a simple gray dress with the sleeves rolled up, and her light brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun. But what caught Preston's attention was the set of her shoulders, straight and proud despite the way Mr. Anderson barely acknowledged her presence as he counted out her meager payment. Preston waited until she had left before asking the store owner about work in the area, and Mr. Anderson was happy to direct him to the Double R Ranch where they were hiring hands for the summer cattle drive. But the older man could not resist adding, in the way of small-town gossips everywhere, that Preston should be careful around certain women in town who had been marked by God's judgment. Preston had learned long ago not to put much stock in gossip, having been the subject of it himself more than once, so he simply nodded, paid for his supplies, and headed out to the ranch. He was hired on the spot by the ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch who cared more about whether a man could sit a horse and rope a steer than about his past or his opinions on theology. The work was hard and the days were long, but Preston had never minded either. He had been working cattle since he was 15, drifting from ranch to ranch across Kansas, Colorado, and now into Oklahoma Territory. He had grown up the youngest son of a wheat farmer in Kansas, but farming had never suited him the way open country did. When his parents died of influenza within days of each other, he had sold the farm, split the money with his two older brothers, and headed west with nothing but his horse, his gear, and a bone-deep need to keep moving. He had learned the cowboy trade from men who measured worth in skill and reliability rather than pedigree, and he had earned their respect by being tough, fair, and unafraid of anything the prairie could throw at him. On his days off, which came every 2 weeks, Preston rode into Kingfisher to replenish supplies and enjoy a hot meal that he had not cooked himself over a campfire. It was on his second visit to town that he saw Penelope again, this time carrying a heavy basket of wet laundry from the pump behind the boarding house to the clothesline strung up in the yard. The basket was clearly too heavy for her, and she had to stop twice to rest, her face flushed with effort. Preston dismounted without thinking, tying his horse to the rail and walking over to the fence line. "Madam, that looks like it could use a second set of hands," he called out, polite but direct. Penelope looked up, startled, and for a moment he thought she might refuse out of pure stubbornness. But then she seemed to measure the distance still to go and nodded, setting down the basket. "I would appreciate that, thank you." Preston opened the gate and walked into the yard, lifting the basket as though it weighed nothing. "Where do you want it?" "By the far line, please." Her voice was quiet but clear, and she walked alongside him as he carried the load across the patchy grass. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, probably not much past 20, with gray-blue eyes that held a wariness he recognized from looking in mirrors after particularly hard seasons. He set the basket down where she indicated and tipped his hat. "Preston Garrett, madam. I am working out at the Double R. Penelope Lawson." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for your help, Mr. Garrett. Just Preston is fine." He smiled and was rewarded by the smallest softening around her eyes. "You take in laundry for the whole town? It feels that way some days." She bent to pull out a sheet, and he noticed the redness of her hands, the way her movements were careful, as though her shoulders pained her. Without asking permission, he reached into the basket and pulled out another sheet, shaking it out and hanging it on the line the way his mother had taught him years ago. "You do not have to do that," Penelope said, but there was no heat in her protest. "I know, but my mama would come back and haunt me if I stood by watching a lady struggle with laundry." He hung another sheet, working efficiently. Besides, many hands make light work, or so I have heard. They worked in companionable silence, hanging the laundry piece by piece. Preston did not press her with questions or small talk, and Penelope seemed to appreciate that. When the basket was empty, she wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him directly for the first time. "That was very kind of you. Most people in town do not go out of their way for me." "Then most people in town are fools," Preston said simply, and was surprised to see a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. He wanted to ask why she was being shunned, but instinct told him that would end this fragile moment of connection. So instead, he just tipped his hat again. "I will leave you to your day, Miss Lawson. But if you need help with heavy lifting again, I am in town most every other Sunday." Over the following weeks, Preston found himself timing his visits to Kingfisher to coincide with the hours when Penelope might be hanging laundry or carrying water or performing any of the dozen other tasks that seemed to fall to her. He told himself it was just good manners to help someone who clearly needed it. But the truth, which he admitted to himself while riding fence lines under the big sky, was that he had been drawn to her from that first moment in the general store. There was a quiet strength to Penelope Lawson that appealed to something deep in his character, and the way the town treated her only made him more determined to show her simple human kindness. Penelope, for her part, found herself watching for the tall cowboy with the easy smile and gentle manners. She had not expected kindness from anyone in Kingfisher, much less from a stranger who had no reason to risk the town's disapproval by associating with her. But Preston seemed utterly unconcerned with what anyone thought, greeting her openly on the street and stopping to talk about the weather, the quality of the grazing grass, or anything else that crossed his mind. He treated her like a person, not a cautionary tale, and that simple respect made her feel human again in a way she had almost forgotten. It was mid-June when Mrs. Fletcher invited Preston to take supper at the boarding house, a gesture she extended to cowboys she deemed respectable and in need of a proper meal. Preston accepted gladly and found himself seated across the table from Penelope and two other boarders, a surveyor named Milton and a school teacher named Miss Pritchard. The conversation flowed easily, and Preston noticed how Penelope gradually relaxed as the meal progressed, even offering a few quiet observations about the territorial politics that were shaping Oklahoma's future. She was well-read and thoughtful, and Preston found himself leaning forward to catch every word. After supper, Mrs. Fletcher shooed everyone out onto the porch to enjoy the evening air, and Preston found himself standing beside Penelope at the railing, looking out at the dusty street that was Kingfisher's main thoroughfare. The sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and pink, painting the flat prairie in colors too beautiful for words. "I heard some talk in town," Preston said carefully, keeping his eyes on the horizon, "about you and some preacher's judgment. I do not put much stock in gossip, but I wanted you to know that if folks are treating you poorly because of it, that is on them, not you." Penelope was silent for a long moment, and he thought perhaps he had overstepped. But then she spoke, her voice low. "Reverend Crane declared that my inability to have children was God's curse. My husband sought an annulment. The town decided the preacher must be right because preachers speak for God, apparently." Preston felt anger rise in his chest, hot and sudden. "That is the biggest load of horse shit I have ever heard, and I have been around cattle for 11 years. Despite herself, Penelope laughed, a surprise sound that seemed to startle her as much as it did him. "You should not say such things about a man of God. I will say what I think about any man, preacher or not, who uses God as an excuse to hurt people." Preston turned to face her fully. "I have known plenty of couples who could not have children, and it was not because of any curse or sin. Sometimes things just are the way they are, and any man who would leave his wife over it is not worth mourning." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "The whole town believes him? Then the whole town is wrong." Preston's voice was firm. "God does not make mistakes like that, Penelope. If you cannot have children, there is a reason that has nothing to do with punishment or sin. Maybe your body just works different. Maybe there is something that could be helped by a real doctor instead of a preacher with a God complex, or maybe it is just one of those mysteries that we are not meant to understand. But it sure as hell is not a curse." No one had spoken to her with such passionate conviction since this nightmare began, and Penelope found herself blinking back tears in earnest now. "You do not even know me. Why do you care?" "Because I have got eyes and a working brain, and I can see that you are a good person being treated badly by folks who should know better." Preston reached out and gently touched her hand where it rested on the railing, just the lightest brush of his fingers. "And because I would like to know you better, if you would allow it." Penelope looked down at his hand covering hers, rough and calloused from years of hard work, and felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since that awful day in her parlor, she felt a flicker of hope. "I would like that too." From that evening forward, Preston made a point of seeing Penelope whenever he could. He would ride into town on his days off, and they would walk together to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie and they could talk without the weight of judgmental stares. He told her about growing up on the wheat farm, about his parents and brothers, about the places he had drifted through in his years as a cowboy. She told him about her childhood in a small town in Missouri, about her love of reading and her dreams of seeing mountains someday, about the garden she had kept at the house she had shared with James, and how she missed having her hands in soil instead of soap water. "Why do you do laundry if you hate it?" Preston asked one afternoon, as they sat in the shade of a scrubby cottonwood tree, the only tree for miles around. "Because it is the only work available to a woman in my position," Penelope said simply. "I am a good seamstress, but no one wants to hire the cursed woman to make their clothes. Laundry is anonymous enough that people will pay for it." Preston frowned. "You are good with plants, though. You could work for someone with a big garden, maybe even start your own business growing vegetables to sell." "With what land? What money for seeds and tools?" Penelope shook her head. "It is a nice dream, but dreams do not pay for room and board." "What if you had help?" Preston said carefully. "What if someone staked you the money and the use of some land?" Penelope looked at him sharply. "I will not take charity, Preston." "It is not charity, it is investment. You grow the vegetables, sell them for profit, and pay back the stake. That is just business." He leaned back against the tree trunk. "The Double R has a section of land near the creek that is not being used for anything. I bet I could talk Dutch into letting you use it in exchange for fresh vegetables for the ranch house, and I have got some money saved that is just sitting in a bank in Dodge City doing nothing." "Why would you do that for me?" Penelope's voice was quiet, almost afraid of the answer. Preston met her eyes steadily. "Because I believe in you. Because you deserve a chance to do work you love instead of work that is killing you by inches. And because I care about you, Penelope, more than I probably should after such a short acquaintance." Penelope felt her breath catch. She had been so focused on survival that she had not let herself acknowledge what was growing between them. But hearing Preston say the words out loud made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I care about you too," she whispered. "But Preston, the town already thinks I am cursed. If you associate too closely with me, they will turn on you too." "Let them." Preston reached out and took her hand properly this time, lacing their fingers together. "I have never been one to worry much about what other people think, and I'm not about to start now. If you are cursed, then I guess I am too, because I cannot seem to stay away from you." They sat together in the shade of that cottonwood tree for hours, talking and planning and gradually inching closer together until Penelope's head was resting against Preston's shoulder and his arm was around her waist. When the sun began to set and they finally walked back toward town, they did so hand in hand, and if anyone noticed or whispered, neither of them cared. True to his word, Preston spoke to Dutch about the unused land near the creek, and the foreman agreed readily, pleased at the prospect of fresh vegetables instead of the canned goods and root vegetables that were the usual fare. Preston sent a telegram to the bank in Dodge City and had funds transferred to the Kingfisher bank, then took Penelope to the general store to buy seeds, tools, and everything else she would need to start her garden. Mr. Anderson's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline when Preston counted out the money, and Penelope kept her chin high as they loaded the supplies into the wagon Preston had borrowed from the ranch. The land Preston had secured was perfect, a quarter-acre plot beside the creek where the soil was rich and dark. Preston helped Penelope break ground, working side by side with her in the hot June sun to turn the soil and prepare the beds. Other ranch hands wandered over during their breaks to watch, and a few offered advice or help. Penelope worked with a fierce joy that Preston had not seen in her before, her face flushed and her eyes bright as she planted neat rows of tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, and lettuce. They rigged up a simple irrigation system from the creek, and within days the first green shoots were pushing up through the dark earth. Penelope began spending her days at the garden instead of hunched over the washboard, and the change in her was remarkable. The lines of strain around her eyes eased, and she smiled more freely. Her hands, though still work-worn, began to heal without the constant assault of lye soap. Preston found excuses to ride over to the creek plot several times a day, ostensibly to check on the irrigation, but really just to see Penelope and steal a few minutes of conversation. The other ranch hands teased him mercilessly, but it was good-natured ribbing, and Dutch just shook his head with a knowing smile. As the summer progressed and the garden flourished, so did the relationship between Preston and Penelope. They had fallen into an easy partnership, working together with the kind of wordless coordination that usually took years to develop. Preston taught Penelope to ride his spare horse, a gentle mare named Clover, and they began taking evening rides out onto the prairie, racing across the grassland with the wind in their faces and the sky huge and endless above them. Penelope laughed during those rides, a free and joyful sound that made Preston's heart clench with emotion so strong it almost frightened him. One evening in late July, they rode out farther than usual, following the creek to where it widened into a shallow pool. The sun was setting, turning everything golden, and Preston dismounted to let the horses drink. Penelope slid down from Clover's back and walked to the edge of the water, looking out at the gentle ripples catching the light. "I never thanked you properly," she said without turning around, "for everything you have done for me." Preston came to stand beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Penelope turned to face him, and in the golden light her eyes were luminous. "You gave me back my life, Preston. More than that, you made me believe I deserved to have a life again. I was drowning before you came to Kingfisher, and I did not even care enough to try to save myself. But you cared. You saw me when everyone else was looking away, and you treated me like I mattered." "You do matter." Preston reached up to cup her face gently in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "You matter to me more than anything. Preston." His name was a sigh on her lips, and then she was rising up on her toes and kissing him, tentative at first but quickly growing more confident. Preston wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, kissing her back with all the pent-up longing of the past months. She tasted like sunshine and creek water, and Preston thought dimly that he could happily kiss her for the rest of his life and never grow tired of it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Penelope rested her forehead against his chest. "I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone again." "Good." Preston kissed the top of her head. "Because I'm not going anywhere, Penelope. I am in this for the long haul, if you will have me." "Yes." She looked up at him, and her smile was radiant. "Yes, I will have you." They rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, and Preston knew without question that he had just committed himself to this woman in a way that went deeper than words. He had never been in love before, not really, but he was in love now, wholly and completely, with a woman the town had written off as cursed. The irony was not lost on him. News of their courtship spread through Kingfisher like wildfire, as Preston had known it would. The reaction was mixed, with some folks shaking their heads at the foolishness of a young cowboy throwing his lot in with a cursed woman, while others, particularly some of the younger ranch hands and a few of the more independent-minded women in town, thought it was romantic. Reverend Crane made a point of stopping Preston on the street one Sunday morning to express his concern for Preston's immortal soul. "That woman has been marked by God's judgment, son," the preacher said in his sonorous voice. "Every inch, the concerned shepherd. You are putting yourself at risk by associating so closely with her." Preston looked at the preacher for a long moment, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Then he said, in a voice that was perfectly polite but hard as iron underneath, "With all due respect, Reverend, I think you are wrong. I think you used your position to justify a man's cowardice, and I think you have caused real harm to a good woman based on nothing but superstition and prejudice. God does not make mistakes like cursing people barren, but men sure do make mistakes when they play at being God." Reverend Crane's face went red, then white. "You are speaking blasphemy." "No, sir, I am speaking truth. And if you cannot tell the difference, then maybe you should not be standing in a pulpit telling other people how to live." Preston tipped his hat, a gesture that was more dismissive than polite. "Good day, Reverend." He walked away before the preacher could respond, and by that evening the entire town was buzzing with the story of how the cowboy from the Double R had stood up to Reverend Crane on behalf of Penelope Lawson. Opinions were divided, but Preston did not care. He had said what needed saying, and he would not take it back. Penelope heard about the confrontation from Mrs. Fletcher, who related the story with barely concealed glee. "About time someone told that pompous windbag what is what," the widow said, setting down a cup of tea in front of Penelope. Half the women in this town have been bitten by his judgments over the years, but no one has had the courage to call him out. Preston should not have risked his reputation for me, Penelope said, but her heart was not in the protest. She was deeply moved by what Preston had done, standing up for her in the most public way possible. That man loves you, Mrs. Fletcher said bluntly. Anyone with eyes can see it. And if you have got a lick of sense, you will hold on to him with both hands, because men like that do not come along every day. Penelope thought about that conversation as she worked in the garden the next day, her hands in the rich soil and the sun warm on her back. The vegetables were thriving, and she had already started selling produce to the ranch and to a few households in town who cared more about fresh food than about gossip. She was making enough money to pay Preston back his stake, with a little left over for herself. For the first time since her marriage ended, she felt like she had a future that belonged to her, one she was building with her own hands. Preston rode up mid-morning, dismounting from his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. He had a bundle wrapped in cloth, which he handed to Penelope with a slightly sheepish expression. "I went into town early this morning and stopped at the bakery. Thought you might like some fresh bread to go with lunch." Penelope unwrapped the cloth to find a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and her eyes misted over at the simple thoughtfulness of the gesture. "You are too good to me." "Impossible." Preston leaned down and kissed her softly. "You want to take a break and eat by the creek?" They sat in the shade of the willows that grew along the creek bank, sharing the bread and some cheese Preston had brought from the ranch house. The water burbled pleasantly over the rocks, and a meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. It was one of those perfect moments that Penelope wanted to hold on to forever, suspended in amber like insects trapped in tree sap. "I have been thinking," Preston said, pulling apart a piece of bread with his fingers, "about the future." Penelope's heart started beating faster. "What about it?" "Well, the trail drive is coming up in September. Dutch wants me to go along, and it is good money, but it means I would be gone for 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. Preston looked at her seriously. "I do not want to be away from you that long, but I also do not want to let Dutch down. He has been good to me, and the ranch needs every experienced hand they can get." "You should go," Penelope said, even though the thought of 2 months without seeing Preston made her chest ache. "It is your job, and I will not be the reason you do not do it well." "What if you came with us?" Preston said suddenly, "and not on the drive itself, but what if you came to Dodge City and waited there? That is where the drive ends, and you could see a new place, maybe sell some of your preserves and dried goods at the markets there. It is a real city. Penelope, with hotels and restaurants and all kinds of things you cannot find in Kingfisher." Penelope stared at him. "I could not afford to stay in Dodge City for 2 months. "You could if you were not paying for a hotel." Preston took her hand. "Penelope, what I am trying to say, very badly apparently, is that I want to marry you. I wanted to ask you proper, like maybe with a ring and a fancy proposal, but I am not good at fancy. I am just a cowboy who is in love with you and wants to build a life with you if you will have me." Penelope felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling so wide her face hurt. Yes, Preston, I will marry you." Preston let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with such enthusiasm that they both nearly toppled over into the creek. When they finally came up for air, both laughing breathlessly, Preston said, "I will get you a ring in Dodge City, I promise. Something pretty that suits you." "I do not need a ring," Penelope said, cupping his face in her hands. "I just need you." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the boarding house, with Mrs. Fletcher and Dutch standing as witnesses, and a circuit judge who happened to be passing through Kingfisher performing the service. Penelope wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her make, and Preston wore his best shirt with a string tie that kept coming crooked until Penelope fixed it for him with gentle hands. The ceremony was brief and unadorned, but when Preston slipped a thin gold band onto Penelope's finger, a temporary ring he had bought from the jeweler in town, with the promise of replacing it with something better in Dodge City, Penelope thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Reverend Crane was conspicuously absent, though he made sure to preach a sermon the following Sunday about the dangers of defying God's will. Most of the town stayed away from the wedding, but a surprising number of the ranch hands showed up, along with a few of the younger townspeople and some of the women who had quietly supported Penelope throughout her ordeal. It was a small gathering, but it was full of genuine warmth, and that meant more to Penelope than a church full of people who attended out of obligation. Preston moved Penelope's belongings from the boarding house to a small cabin on the ranch that had been used for storage, but which Dutch had agreed to let them fix up and use as a home. It was just 2 rooms and desperately in need of repair, but Penelope saw past the dust and the holes in the roof to the potential underneath. They spent every spare moment over the next weeks patching the roof, scrubbing the floors, and making the cabin livable. Preston built a real bed frame to replace the corn husk mattress on the floor, and Penelope sewed curtains from flour sacks she had carefully washed and bleached. By the time they finished, the cabin was small and simple, but it was theirs, and that made it more valuable than any mansion. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, with Preston showing a patience and gentleness that made Penelope fall even more deeply in love with him. He treated her like she was precious, something to be cherished. And when she cried afterward, it was not from pain or regret, but from overwhelming emotion at finally being loved the way she deserved. Preston held her close and stroked her hair and whispered that he loved her, and Penelope felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. The weeks before the cattle drive passed in a blur of happiness. Penelope continued to tend her garden, preserving and drying much of the produce to sell in Dodge City, while Preston worked long days preparing for the drive. They fell into bed each night exhausted but content, wrapped around each other in the narrow bed, and Penelope marveled at how completely her life had changed in just a few short months. She had gone from being a woman with no future to a woman with a husband she loved, work she enjoyed, and a home of her own. It seemed almost too good to be true, and sometimes she woke in the night with a start, afraid it had all been a dream. But Preston was always there, solid and real beside her, and he would pull her close and murmur sleepy reassurances until she drifted back to sleep. He was her anchor, her safe harbor, and she loved him with a fierceness that sometimes scared her. She had never loved James this way, she realized. What she had felt for her first husband had been a tepid affection compared to the all-consuming love she felt for Preston. This was what love was supposed to be: partnership and passion and bone-deep trust all tangled together. In early September, the cattle drive assembled at the Double R over 300 head of cattle, and a dozen cowboys, including Preston and Dutch, would make the long journey north to the railhead in Dodge City. Penelope would follow in a wagon with 2 other ranch wives who were making the trip, a journey that would take about 2 weeks at the slower pace the wagon required. Preston did not like the idea of being separated, even for that time, but Penelope assured him she would be fine, and he finally relented. The morning the drive left was chaotic and loud, with the cattle bawling and the horses dancing nervously and the cowboys shouting instructions to each other. Preston rode over to where Penelope stood watching and leaned down to kiss her thoroughly, ignoring the hoots and cat calls from the other hands. "I will see you in Dodge City," he said, his hand cupping her cheek. 2 weeks, maybe less, if we make good time." "Be safe," Penelope said, holding onto his hand for as long as she could. "Do not do anything stupid trying to impress the other cowboys." Preston grinned. "I promise to only do moderately stupid things." Then he was gone, riding to take his position with the herd, and Penelope watched until the last of the cattle disappeared over the horizon in a cloud of dust. The ranch felt strangely empty without the cowboys and the noise, and Penelope was suddenly glad she would be leaving in a few days rather than staying behind in the too quiet cabin. The wagon journey to Dodge City was long and uncomfortable, but also surprisingly enjoyable. Penelope had worried that the other 2 wives, both older women who had been married to their cowboy husbands for years, might judge her for her past, but instead they welcomed her warmly. Sarah was the wife of one of the senior hands, a woman in her 40s with a dry sense of humor and endless patience, while Ruth was younger, perhaps 30, and pregnant with her 3rd child. They shared stories and songs to pass the time, and taught Penelope tricks for managing life as a cowboy's wife. "The hardest part is the separation soaring," Sarah said one evening as they made camp. "You get used to it eventually, but it never stops being hard to watch them ride away." "How do you manage it?" Penelope asked, poking at the fire. "You build your own life," Ruth said, rubbing her swollen belly. "You cannot just sit around waiting for them to come home, or you will go crazy. You need work and friends and interests that are yours. That way, when they are gone, you still have a life. And when they are home, you have things to share with each other." Penelope thought about her garden and felt a surge of gratitude for Preston's foresight in helping her establish it. She had work she loved, and that would sustain her through the times when Preston was away on drives or other ranch business. It would not be easy, but she was tougher than she used to be, toughened by adversity and hardship. She could handle whatever came. They reached Dodge City on a hot afternoon in late September, and Penelope was overwhelmed by the size and noise of the place. Dodge was a cattle town, rough and rowdy, with wide streets churned to mud by thousands of hooves and sidewalks crowded with cowboys, gamblers, merchants, and women of questionable reputation. The smell was overwhelming. A combination of cattle, dust, manure, sweat, and wood smoke that made Penelope's eyes water. But there was also an energy to the place, a sense of possibility and excitement that was intoxicating. Sarah had relatives in Dodge who ran a boarding house on the respectable side of town, and they had agreed to let the three women stay for a reasonable rate. The house was clean and well kept, with real glass in the windows and a kitchen that made Penelope's mouth water just looking at all the modern conveniences. After weeks of sleeping on the hard ground and eating food cooked over an open fire, the soft bed and hot bath felt like pure luxury. The cattle drive arrived 2 days later, and Penelope was waiting on the sidewalk outside the stockyards when the herd came thundering down the main street. She spotted Preston riding near the front of the herd, his face dusty and his shoulders tired, and her heart swelled with love and pride. He looked like he belonged here, in this rough and tumble cattle town, a man in his element. When he finally saw her, his whole face lit up, and he spurred his horse over to the sidewalk, leaning down to kiss her right there in front of God and everyone. "I missed you," he said against her lips, and Penelope laughed and kissed him again. "I missed you too. You look terrible." "I feel terrible. I need a bath, a meal that is not beans, and about 12 hours of sleep." Preston dismounted and stretched, wincing. "But first I need to help get these cattle settled, and then Dutch will want to make sure everyone gets paid. It is going to be a few hours yet." "I will be at the boarding house," Penelope said, giving him the address. "Come find me when you are done." Preston did not arrive until nearly midnight, but he was clean and fed and looking much more human. Penelope had been dozing in a chair by the window, but she woke when he tapped softly on the door. She let him in, and he swept her up in his arms, carrying her to the bed and laying down beside her with a groan of relief. "This is the best moment of the entire drive, Funerer," he said, wrapping himself around her. "Right here with you." They stayed in Dodge City for a week, while the ranch business was concluded and the cowboys enjoyed their pay and the entertainments the city had to offer. Preston took Penelope to a real restaurant where they ate steak and potatoes on actual china plates, and to a jeweler where he kept his promise and bought her a beautiful ring with a small sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. Penelope protested that it was too expensive, but Preston insisted, slipping it onto her finger and kissing her hand. "You deserve beautiful things," he said firmly, "and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have them." They walked through the busy streets hand in hand, marveling at the stores and the variety of goods available. Penelope sold her preserved vegetables and dried goods at the market and made more money in 3 days than she had made in 3 months of taking in laundry. She bought fabric for new dresses, seeds for next year's garden, and a set of real gardening tools to replace the makeshift ones she had been using. Preston bought a new saddle and some books for Penelope, knowing how much she loved to read. On their last night in Dodge City, they attended a dance at one of the saloons that had been converted for a special community event. Penelope wore her new dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Preston wore his best shirt and actually looked comfortable in it. They danced until Penelope's feet hurt, and then they danced some more because the music was lively and they were young and in love and everything felt possible. The journey back to Kingfisher was easier than the journey to Dodge, perhaps because they were going home. Penelope rode beside Preston on Clover, and they talked about their plans for the future. Preston wanted to save enough money to eventually buy a small piece of land of their own, maybe near Kingfisher or maybe somewhere new, where they could raise horses and cattle, and Penelope could have a large garden. Penelope wanted to expand her vegetable business, maybe even sell to restaurants in some of the bigger towns. They were dreams, but they were achievable dreams grounded in hard work and practical planning. When they finally rode back onto the Double R in late October, the cabin looked different to Penelope. It was still small and simple, but it was home in a way that no place had ever been before. She and Preston settled back into their routine, but something had shifted. The trip to Dodge City had shown them a larger world, and while they were happy at the ranch, they both began to think seriously about what came next. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-November and the temperatures plunging. Penelope's garden had been harvested before the drive, and she spent the long winter evenings preserving the last of the produce and planning next year's planting. Preston worked around the ranch, mending fences and tending to the horses and cattle that had not gone to market. The work was cold and often miserable, but there was satisfaction in it, and Preston took pride in being reliable and skilled. In December, Penelope realized her monthly bleeding had not come. She said nothing to Preston at first, not wanting to get his hopes up. But when January came and went without any sign, she finally allowed herself to believe what her body was telling her. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also fear. What if Reverend Crane had been right after all and she was cursed? What if something went wrong? But then she remembered Preston's words from that first conversation on Mrs. Fletcher's porch. God does not make mistakes like that. She was not cursed. She was just a woman whose body had needed time, or the right circumstances, or perhaps simply the love of a man who believed in her. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered a prayer of thanks to whatever benevolent force governed the universe. She told Preston on a cold January evening as they sat by the fire in their cabin. He had been reading aloud from one of the books he had bought in Dodge City, a novel about adventure on the high seas, when she reached over and took the book from his hands. "Preston, I need to tell you something." He looked at her, immediately attentive. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right." Penelope took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I am pregnant." Preston stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally pure, radiant joy. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," Penelope smiled. "My courses have not come since before the cattle drive, and I have been feeling queasy in the mornings. I think it is real, Preston." Preston let out a shout of joy and pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "I knew it! I knew that Preacher was full of horse manure. You were never cursed, Penelope, never!" They held each other for a long time, rocking gently beside the fire, and Penelope felt a completeness that she had never imagined possible. She was loved, she was valued, and she was going to be a mother. The Reverend had been wrong. The town had been wrong, and even she had been wrong to believe, even for a moment, that she was somehow broken or less than. Preston had seen the truth when no one else had, and he had loved her back to wholeness. Word of Penelope's pregnancy spread through the ranch quickly, and the congratulations were genuine and warm. Dutch shook Preston's hand so hard it hurt, and Sarah and Ruth made a fuss over Penelope, offering advice and knitting tiny garments. When the news inevitably made its way to Kingfisher, the reaction was more mixed. Some people took it as proof that Reverend Crane had been wrong all along, while others muttered that perhaps the curse had been lifted through Preston's faith. Penelope did not care what they thought. She had learned that the opinions of small-minded people were worth exactly nothing. Reverend Crane himself said nothing publicly, but Penelope heard through Mrs. Fletcher, that he had been seen leaving town on the stagecoach in early February, bound for Kansas and a new congregation. Apparently his credibility had been damaged beyond repair by Preston's public challenge and Penelope's pregnancy, and the church elders had suggested he might be happier elsewhere. Penelope felt a grim satisfaction at that news. She did not wish the man ill exactly, but she was glad he would not be around to spread his poison anymore. As winter gave way to spring, Penelope's pregnancy became obvious. Her belly swelled gently beneath her dresses, and she felt the first flutters of movement in late March. Preston was fascinated by every aspect of her changing body, placing his hands on her stomach to feel the baby kick and talking to the child through her skin. He had already started building a cradle in his spare time, carving the wood with careful precision and rubbing it smooth with oil. Penelope continued to work in her garden as long as she was able, though she had to accept more help as her pregnancy progressed. Preston was always hovering, worried she would overdo it, and finally Penelope had to ban him from the garden during the day because his anxious presence was driving her crazy. He took it well mostly, though he still found excuses to ride by several times a day just to check on her. In late May, with the garden in full bloom and the prairie green with spring grass, Penelope went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting nearly 20 hours, with Sarah and Ruth and the ranch cook, a woman named Maria who had delivered more babies than she could count, all attending her. Preston was banished to the porch where he wore a path in the boards with his pacing, and Dutch had to physically restrain him from bursting into the cabin every time Penelope cried out. But finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, a baby's wail split the air, and Sarah emerged from the cabin with a broad smile. "You have a son, Preston. A big, healthy boy." Preston nearly knocked her over in his rush to get inside. Penelope was propped up in bed, exhausted and pale, but smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets Ruth had knitted. Preston approached slowly, almost reverently, and Penelope pulled back the blanket to reveal a red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," Penelope said softly, and Preston reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers. "He is perfect," Preston whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. God, Penelope, I love you so much. I love you too." Penelope was crying now, happy tears that tracked down her cheeks. "We did it, Preston. We made a family." They named the baby Peter after Preston's father, and he was christened in a small ceremony at the cabin with Dutch standing as godfather and Sarah as godmother. The christening was performed by the new circuit preacher, a young man who was more interested in grace than judgment, and the gathering afterward was full of laughter and good food and genuine celebration. Peter was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he grew quickly under his parents' devoted care. Preston was besotted with his son, spending every spare moment holding him or talking to him or just watching him sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. Penelope recovered from the birth slowly but surely, and by midsummer she was back to working in her garden with Peter sleeping in a basket in the shade nearby. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more tiring than before, but also infinitely richer. Penelope's vegetable business continued to thrive, and she was now supplying 3 ranches and several families in Kingfisher with fresh produce. Preston was promoted to a senior position on the ranch, with a raise in pay that meant they could start saving seriously for their own land. They talked about it often during the quiet moments after Peter had fallen asleep, planning the house they would build and the life they would make. When Peter was 6 months old, Preston came home one evening with news that made Penelope's heart skip a beat. "There is a quarter section of land for sale about 10 miles from here, right along the creek. It has good grazing, good water, and enough flat land for a large garden. The price is fair, and I have been talking to the banker about a loan. I think we could do it, Penelope. I think we could buy our own place." They rode out to look at the land the next Sunday with Peter bundled in a sling against Penelope's chest. The property was everything Preston had described: rolling prairie with a reliable creek running through it, and a small stand of cottonwood trees that would provide shade and windbreak. There was no house, but Preston assured her he could build one, with help from the other ranch hands. Penelope walked the land with tears in her eyes, seeing not what it was but what it could be. Their own place, their own future, built with their own hands. The paperwork was finalized in October, and by November Preston had begun building their house. It was slow work, done in fits and starts around his ranch duties, but by the following spring the basic structure was complete. It was not large, just 4 rooms, but it was solid and well built, with real glass in the windows and a stone fireplace that Preston had labored over for weeks. Penelope planted flowers around the foundation and started a kitchen garden in the sunny spot behind the house, and slowly the raw new building began to feel like a home. They moved in on a warm day in May, almost exactly 2 years after Preston had first ridden into Kingfisher. Penelope stood in the doorway of their new house, Peter balanced on her hip and Preston's arm around her shoulders, and looked out at the land that was now theirs. The prairie stretched out in every direction, vast and beautiful, and Penelope felt her heart swell with gratitude for the unlikely chain of events that had brought her to this moment. "Thank you," she said, turning to look up at Preston, "for everything, for believing in me when no one else did, for giving me back my life and my faith in the future." "You did not need me to give you anything," Preston said, kissing her temple. "You just needed someone to remind you of what you already had. You are strong and capable and amazing, Penelope Garrett, and you would have found your way eventually." "Maybe, but I'm glad I found it with you." Penelope shifted Peter to her other hip, and the toddler grabbed a fistful of her hair, babbling happily. "What do you think, Peter? Do you like our new house?" Peter responded with a string of nonsense syllables and a wide, gummy smile, and both parents laughed. They went inside together, ready to begin the next chapter of their life, and Penelope sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the cowboy who had seen past a preacher's curse to the truth underneath. God had not made her barren as punishment. God had simply been waiting for the right time, the right man, and the right circumstances to bless her with the family she had always wanted. Over the years that followed, Preston and Penelope built a life that exceeded both their expectations. The ranch prospered, with Preston breeding horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality and temperament. Penelope's garden grew to cover nearly 2 acres, and she supplied vegetables to restaurants as far away as Guthrie and Oklahoma City. They hired help as the business expanded, including a young couple who lived in a small house Preston built on the far side of the property. Peter grew into a lively, curious boy who followed his father everywhere and helped his mother in the garden with enthusiastic but often unhelpful energy. When he was 3, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Pauline, a tiny girl with her mother's gray-blue eyes and her father's dark hair. 2 years later came another son, whom they named Paul, and the house that had seemed so spacious with just 3 people suddenly felt comfortably full. Penelope's relationship with Kingfisher gradually improved, especially after Reverend Crane's departure and the arrival of more progressive residents as the territory grew. She never forgot the people who had shunned her, but she chose to extend grace rather than holding grudges, and over time she built a reputation as a fair and honest businesswoman. Some of the older residents never fully accepted her, but the younger generation knew her only as Mrs. Garrett, the woman with the successful market garden and the handsome cowboy husband. Sarah and Ruth remained close friends, and their families often gathered for meals and celebrations. Dutch retired from the Double R and bought a small place near Kingfisher, where he raised chickens and offered unsolicited advice to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Fletcher lived to the ripe old age of 79, sharp and opinionated to the end, and when she died she left Penelope a small bequest in her will, along with a note that read simply, "You were always stronger than you knew." Preston never lost his love of the open range, and once a year he would join a cattle drive, more for the joy of it than the money. But he always came home to Penelope and their children, and those homecomings were among the sweetest moments of their life together. They would stand on the porch of their house, watching him ride in across the prairie, and Penelope would feel the same surge of love and gratitude she had felt that first day he had helped her with the laundry basket. They faced challenges, of course, as all families do. There were droughts that threatened the garden and the grazing land, illnesses that kept them up nights with worry, and the usual struggles of raising children and running a business, but they faced everything together, with the same partnership and trust that had defined their relationship from the beginning. When things were hard, Preston would remind Penelope of the day they met, when she had been carrying that heavy basket and he had simply stepped in to help, and they would remember that sometimes the most important thing was just showing up for each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Penelope back to the cottonwood tree where he had first told her he loved her. The tree had grown in the intervening years, its branches spreading wider, and someone, probably one of the ranch hands, had carved their initials in the trunk. They sat in the shade just as they had a decade earlier, but this time they were not young people tentatively exploring new love. They were partners who had built a life together through hard work, faith, and sheer stubborn determination. "Do you ever regret it?" Penelope asked, leaning against Preston's shoulder. "Walking away from the freedom of being a drifting cowboy to tie yourself down with a wife and children and a mortgage?" Preston laughed. "Not even for a second. That freedom was just loneliness dressed up in romantic language. This, right here, this is what I was looking for all along. I just did not know it until I met you." "I was so lost when you found me," Penelope said quietly. "I thought my life was over." "Your life was just beginning." Preston kissed the top of her head, "and I am grateful every single day that I was there to see it." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie they had claimed as their own. In the distance, they could hear their children playing, their laughter carrying on the wind, and Penelope thought about how far she had come from that terrible day in her parlor when her first marriage had ended. She had been declared cursed by a preacher who thought he spoke for God, rejected by a town that valued judgment over compassion, and reduced to a life of drudgery and shame. But then a cowboy had ridden into town and changed everything, not because he had rescued her like some fairy tale prince, but because he had seen her as a person worthy of respect and love. He had given her the tools and the support to save herself, and in doing so, he had shown her that she had never been cursed at all. She had simply been waiting for the right person to remind her of her own worth. As the years continued to pass, Preston and Penelope watched their children grow and thrive. Peter inherited his father's love of horses and his mother's stubborn determination, and by the time he was 16, he was one of the best young horsemen in the territory. Pauline was quieter and more bookish, with a talent for numbers that made her invaluable in managing the family businesses. Paul was the adventurer, always exploring and asking questions and getting into friendly trouble. When Peter turned 19, he met a girl at a dance in Kingfisher, the daughter of a shopkeeper, and Preston and Penelope watched with bittersweet pride as their oldest son fell in love. The girl, whose name was Martha, was sweet and practical, and she fit into the family easily. Preston taught Peter how to build a house, just as he had built theirs, and when Peter and Martha married, it was in the front yard of Preston and Penelope's house, under the big sky they all loved. Pauline went to Teachers College in Oklahoma City, one of the first women from Kingfisher to pursue higher education, and came back with a degree and a quiet confidence that made her parents' hearts swell. She taught at the local school and eventually married a lawyer from Guthrie, a kind man who appreciated her intelligence and supported her independence. Paul was the last to settle down, spending several years working on various ranches and drives before finally buying land adjacent to his parents' property and raising cattle. Through it all, Preston and Penelope remained the center of their growing family, the axis around which everyone else revolved. Their house became the gathering place for holidays and celebrations, always full of children and grandchildren and the easy affection of a family that genuinely liked each other. Penelope's garden continued to flourish, and she taught her daughters-in-law and granddaughters the skills she had learned, passing on not just horticultural knowledge, but the understanding that a woman could build her own future with her own hands. Preston aged gracefully, his dark hair going silver, but his body staying strong from years of physical labor. He never lost his easy smile or his habit of treating Penelope like she was the most precious thing in his world. Even after decades of marriage, he would still bring her wildflowers from the prairie, still kiss her like he meant it, still tell her he loved her with the same sincerity he had shown that first evening by the creek. Penelope's hair went silver too, and her hands grew gnarled from years of working in the soil, but her eyes remained bright and her spirit strong. She had outlived most of the people who had judged her back in those dark days after her first marriage ended, and she took quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had built a better life than any of them could have imagined for her. She was respected in the community, loved by her family, and content in a way that transcended the simple absence of trouble. On a warm evening in late spring when Penelope was 68 years old and Preston was 70, they sat together on the porch of their house and watched their grandchildren play in the yard. There were 8 of them now, ranging in age from 2 to 17, and the noise and chaos were glorious. Preston reached over and took Penelope's hand, lacing their fingers together the way he had been doing for 44 years. "I have been thinking," he said, and Penelope smiled because that was how so many of their best conversations started. "About what?" "About that day I first saw you at the general store carrying that basket of mending. I almost did not stop to help with the laundry, you know. I thought maybe it would be presumptuous, or you would think I was trying to flirt, or any number of reasons not to get involved." "What made you do it anyway?" Preston was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think some part of me recognized you even though we had never met. Recognized something essential and true and worth knowing. And I am so glad I listened to that instinct because everything good in my life came from that choice." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You changed my life, Preston Garrett. You took a woman everyone had given up on and showed her that she was worth fighting for." "No." Preston shook his head gently. "I just reminded you of what was already there. You were always strong, always capable, always worthy of love. You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Penelope thought about the long, winding path that had brought her to this moment. She had been married twice, first to a man who had abandoned her based on a preacher's cruel words, and then to a man who had defended her against those same words with a faith that moved mountains. She had been called cursed, and then blessed, barren, and then fruitful, worthless, and then invaluable. But the truth was that she had always been exactly herself, a woman of strength and grace and quiet determination. The circumstances had changed, the people around her had changed, but the essential core of who she was had remained constant. Preston had not transformed her. He had simply given her the space and support to become the person she had always been capable of being. As the evening deepened and the grandchildren were called inside for supper, Preston and Penelope remained on the porch, reluctant to leave the peace of the moment. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and eternal, and overhead the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you remember what you said to me that day on Mrs. Fletcher's porch?" Penelope asked, "just when I told you about the preacher's judgment." "I said a lot of things that day." Preston smiled. "But I remember the most important one. I said God does not make mistakes like that. And I meant it then and I mean it now. You were never cursed, Penelope. You were just waiting for your life to begin." "It was a good life," Penelope said softly, "a very good life." "It is not over yet," Preston pointed out. "We still have plenty of living to do." And they did. They had years yet ahead of them, years of watching their grandchildren grow and their family expand, years of working the land they loved and sleeping in the house they had built. They had years of sunrise walks and evening conversations, of shared meals and quiet moments, of all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that make up a well-lived life. But even if they had not, even if this evening on the porch had been their last, Penelope would have been satisfied, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that a person's worth is not determined by the judgments of others or the failures of the body, or the cruel words of self-appointed moral authorities. A person's worth is inherent and unshakable, and the right partner will see that truth and honor it every single day. Preston had been that partner for her, and she had been that partner for him. Together they had built not just a house or a business or a family, but a life of mutual respect, deep affection, and unshakable commitment. They had proved that a preacher's curse was no match for a cowboy's faith, and that love, real love, could overcome any obstacle. As the stars came out fully and the prairie settled into its nighttime quiet, Preston helped Penelope to her feet, and they walked inside together hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. Behind them, the land they had claimed and nurtured spread out under the vast Oklahoma sky, a testament to everything they had built and everything they had become. And somewhere in the darkness, the cottonwood tree where it had all begun swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the night. Their story had begun with judgment and pain, but it had blossomed into joy and fulfillment. It had begun with a woman declared cursed and a cowboy willing to challenge that declaration. It had begun with a simple act of kindness, a basket of laundry too heavy to carry alone, and from that small beginning had grown a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of seeing someone truly and loving them completely. Years later, long after Preston and Penelope had both passed on to whatever lay beyond this life, their descendants would still tell the story. They would tell it to their own children and grandchildren, passing down not just the facts, but the lesson contained within. That a person should never accept someone else's definition of their worth. That true love means believing in your partner even when the world does not. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stand up and say loudly and clearly that the emperor has no clothes and the preacher does not speak for God. And they would tell how Preston Garrett, a cowboy with more faith than sense and a heart big enough to encompass the whole prairie, had looked at a woman the town had written off and said the words that changed everything. Words that cut through years of pain and doubt and shame. Words that spoke a truth so fundamental and so powerful that they reshaped reality itself. God does not make mistakes like that. Those 7 words had been Penelope's salvation and Preston's gift, and together they had built a life that honored the truth contained within them. They had raised children who knew their own worth and passed that knowledge on. They had created a family legacy of strength and compassion and unwavering faith in the inherent goodness of people. The house they built still stood decades later, weathered but solid, a landmark in the area. The garden Penelope had started had been expanded over the generations, and the Garrett family vegetables were still sought after throughout the territory and beyond. The horses Preston had bred became a recognized line, prized for their intelligence and gentle temperament. But more than any physical legacy, Preston and Penelope left behind a story of hope, of second chances, of love that looked past the surface to see the truth underneath. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the Oklahoma prairie, you could still find young couples sitting beneath that old cottonwood tree by the creek, carving their initials into the bark worn smooth by time and touching the place where PG and PL had been carved so many years before. They would sit there and tell each other the story they had heard from their parents and grandparents, the story of the preacher who said God had cursed a woman barren, and the cowboy who said God does not make mistakes like that. It was a story that belonged to the prairie itself now, woven into the fabric of the place, as much a part of the land as the grass and the sky and the ever-flowing creek. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that judgment and cruelty could be overcome, that love was stronger than hate, and that sometimes the most radical act of faith was simply believing in another person when no one else would. Preston and Penelope Garrett had lived that truth every day of their long lives together, and in doing so, they had created something that transcended their individual existences. They had created a love story that would echo through generations, reminding people that the power to change a life, to heal a wound, to challenge an injustice, often begins with a single act of kindness and the courage to speak truth to power. Their children and grandchildren carried that legacy forward, living lives of integrity and compassion, standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves, and always believing that people were worthy of love and respect regardless of what the world might say about them. The Garrett name became synonymous with fairness and decency in that part of Oklahoma. And while the family never sought recognition or praise, they were quietly proud of what their matriarch and patriarch had built. And so the story came full circle, from pain to healing, from judgment to redemption, from loneliness to love. It was not a fairy tale with a magic wand and an instant transformation. It was something better. A real story about real people who chose to believe in each other and in the possibility of happiness even when the world told them it was impossible. Penelope had been 24 years old and divorced when Preston rode into her life. She had been declared cursed, abandoned by her husband, shunned by her community, and reduced to back-breaking labor just to survive. She had every reason to be bitter, to give up, to accept the narrative that had been thrust upon her. But she had not. She had endured. And when a cowboy offered her kindness and hope, she had been brave enough to accept it, to build on it, to let it transform her life. Preston had been 26 years old and drifting when he met Penelope. He had been searching for something he could not name, moving from place to place in the hope that the next town, the next job, the next sunrise would finally satisfy the restlessness in his soul. But when he saw a woman struggling under the weight of more than just a laundry basket, when he looked past the surface to see the strength and grace beneath, he had found what he was looking for. He had found home. Together they had built something beautiful and lasting. They had faced down prejudice and hardship. They had worked until their hands bled and their backs ached. They had raised children and tended the land and loved each other through decades of joy and sorrow. And in the end, they had proved that a preacher's curse was powerless in the face of love, that believed, truly believed in the fundamental goodness and worth of another person. Their story was unique to them, but the lesson it contained was universal. Every person who heard it took away something different, but the core message remained constant, that we are not defined by others' judgments, that love sees past surfaces to truth, and that God, however we understand that term, does not make mistakes like cursing people for being human. Penelope Lawson Garrett lived to be 73 years old, and when she died peacefully in her sleep with Preston's hand in hers, the entire community mourned. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, from neighboring ranchers to city officials to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had been blessed to know her. The new preacher, a woman who had come to Kingfisher from the east and who understood grace in a way Reverend Crane never had, spoke about Penelope's legacy of strength and compassion, and not a single eye was dry. Preston lived another 5 years after Penelope passed, and while he remained active and engaged with his family, those who knew him best could see that part of his heart had gone with his wife. He spoke of her often, always with love, always with gratitude for the life they had shared. When he finally followed her into death at the age of 78, his children found among his possessions a journal he had kept throughout their marriage, page after page filled with his observations and reflections on their life together. On the last page, written just days before his death, were these words, "I have been blessed beyond measure. I found the love of my life in a dusty Oklahoma town, and she gave me purpose and joy for more than 5 decades. People called her cursed, but she was the greatest blessing I ever received. If I have learned anything in this life, it is that love is not about perfection or meeting other people's standards. Love is about seeing someone truly, accepting them completely, and choosing them every single day." Penelope was easy to choose. She always was. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery outside Kingfisher, under a shared headstone that bore their names, their dates, and a simple inscription, "God does not make mistakes." Visitors to their grave would stand there and tell their companions the story, and new generations would learn about the preacher's curse and the cowboy's faith and the love that had overcome it all. The house stood for another 100 years before finally being donated to the Oklahoma Historical Society and turned into a museum celebrating early territorial life. The garden was maintained by volunteers, still producing vegetables that were sold to support the museum's operations. Preston's horse breeding program evolved and continued through his descendants. And the story, the beautiful, heartbreaking, ultimately triumphant story, lived on. Because some stories are too important to forget. Some stories capture truths too essential to let fade. And the story of Preston and Penelope Garrett, of the preacher who said God had cursed her Barren, and the cowboy who said God does not make mistakes like that, was one of those stories. It spoke to the best of human nature, to our capacity for love and faith, and the courage to stand against injustice. It reminded people that one person's belief in another can change everything, that kindness matters, that love wins. And so as the years turned into decades, and the decades turned into a century and beyond, the story continued to be told. It was told around campfires and dinner tables and classrooms and churches, anywhere people gathered and talked about what it means to live a good life. It was told to children who needed to know that they were worthy of love and to adults who had forgotten. It was told to remind people that the judgments of others hold only the power we give them, and that faith, real faith, means believing in possibilities that others cannot see. The prairie where Preston and Penelope had built their life continued on, vast and beautiful and eternal. The creek still flowed, the grass still grew, and the sky still stretched overhead in all its glory. The cottonwood tree where Preston had first declared his love grew old and eventually fell in a storm, but a new tree sprouted from its roots, reaching toward the sky just as the old one had. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear their voices on the breeze, laughing and talking and planning their future together. You could almost see them, young and in love, sitting by the creek with the whole world spread out before them. You could almost feel the hope and joy and fierce determination that had defined their life together, because love like that does not die. It transforms, it evolves, it passes into story and legend, but it never truly ends. Preston and Penelope's love had been tested by judgment and hardship, by distance and time, by all the challenges that life could throw at them, and it had endured. It had triumphed. It had become something larger than themselves, a beacon for everyone who came after, a proof that love is stronger than hate, faith is stronger than fear, and the truth, spoken with conviction and compassion, can overcome any lie. That was their legacy. Not the house or the land or the business or even the children, though all of those were important. Their real legacy was the story itself and the lesson it taught, that every person deserves to be seen truly, loved completely, and believed in absolutely. That no one, no matter how eloquent or authoritative, has the right to declare another person cursed or worthless. That God, the universe, fate, whatever name we give to the force that governs existence, does not make mistakes like condemning people for being beautifully, imperfectly human. The preacher had been wrong. The town had been wrong. Everyone who had judged Penelope Lawson based on her inability to have children during her first marriage had been wrong. And Preston Garrett, a cowboy with a good heart and a clear eye, had been absolutely right. God does not make mistakes like that. Penelope had not been cursed. She had simply been waiting for the right person, the right time, the right love to unlock everything she had always been capable of becoming. And when that person arrived, when Preston rode into Kingfisher on that hot May morning in 1884, everything changed. Not because he was perfect or because he had all the answers, but because he was willing to look past the surface, to question the judgment of those in power, to believe in a woman everyone else had given up on. He had offered kindness when the world offered cruelty, hope when others offered despair, love when she had been told she was unlovable. That was the true miracle of their story. Not that Penelope eventually had children, though that was wonderful and joyful, and a vindication of Preston's faith. The true miracle was that Preston had seen Penelope's worth from the very beginning, before there was any evidence to support his belief, before she had proved anything to anyone. He had believed in her simply because she existed, because she was a person deserving of dignity and respect and love. And Penelope, for her part, had been brave enough to accept that belief, to let it take root in her heart, to use it as the foundation for rebuilding her life. She had not been passive in her own salvation. She had worked, struggled, persevered, and fought for every inch of the life she wanted. But she had done it knowing that someone believed in her, and that belief had made all the difference. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and silence and the slow fade into memory. But the impact of their lives continued on, rippling outward through time, touching people they would never meet, inspiring choices they would never see. They had lived well and loved fully, and in doing so they had created something that transcended their individual existences. The preacher had said God cursed her barren. The cowboy had said God does not make mistakes like that. And in the end, the cowboy had been right. There had been no curse, only human cruelty disguised as divine judgment. There had been no mistake, only a woman and a man finding each other at exactly the right moment and choosing to build a life together based on mutual respect, deep affection, and unwavering faith. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was the truth that echoed across generations and would continue to echo as long as people told stories and believed in love. Preston and Penelope Garrett had lived and died, as all people do, but their love had become something eternal, something that would inspire and comfort and challenge people for as long as the story was told. And so the tale came to its close, not with sadness but with satisfaction, not with regret but with gratitude, not with an ending but with a beginning that would never truly end. Because love like that, love that overcomes judgment and hardship and all the obstacles the world can create, that kind of love is eternal. It transforms everyone it touches, and through those transformations, it changes the world. The preacher said God had cursed her barren. A cowboy said God does not make mistakes like that. And that simple statement of faith, spoken with conviction by a man who believed in the inherent goodness of the woman he loved, had changed everything. It had healed wounds, challenged injustice, and created a legacy that would endure for generations. It had proved that one person's belief in another can move mountains, that love is the strongest force in the universe, and that sometimes the most radical act of all is simply treating another person with the dignity and respect they deserve. That was the story of Preston and Penelope Garrett. That was their gift to the world. And that was why, more than a century after they lived and loved and died, people still told their story, still visited their grave, still stood beneath the descendants of that cottonwood tree and marveled at the power of love to overcome anything, everything, always.